take it home where you spread it around. If you don't like who's in there, vote them out. That's what election day is all about. And the biggest gun we got is called the ballot box. If you don't like who's in there, vote them out. Vote them out. Vote them out. And when they're gone, we'll sing and dance and shout. And she'll bring some new ones in, and they will start the show again. And if you don't like who's in there, vote them out.
On the 12th of March, 2019, from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. This is both special programming and programming specific to the 2020 campaign coming up. The title of the episode, at least our working title, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at South by Southwest. South by Southwest is a gigantic music festival, but formerly music festival, now it's many, many things. This time around it was a meeting of political candidates in addition to other things. There were many, many venues there, but of the political people that were there, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had the largest audience, and two, I believe, oversized rooms for overflow there. Some of the other well-known candidates that appeared there, Elizabeth Warren was there. Her reception, according to reports I was looking at the BBC, was not bad at all. She was there talking about what she normally talks about, the financial situation, inequality, etc., while sipping a Michelob beer. Ultra, I think. I believe it's a light beer. Anyway, and of course they had several of the other candidates. Yang, that's running as a Democrat, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, was there. Amy Klobuchar was there. She had a respectable reception there. She was the moderate. And you have all of these candidates now out here on the campaign trail. Following us will be the full presentation of AOC's discussion there at South by Southwest. It's interesting because I was looking for the program to find it and ran into on YouTube that it had been taken down because of copyright problems, they said, either by YouTube or by Amazon Web Services was in there also. But nonetheless, and this is a paid event where you buy tickets to it, and it's live. I finally found it on TikTok by Bloomberg, and we did the recording there. In it, AOC explains what the Green New Deal is and what it purports to do. It's a visionary a program that what things would be like in 2050. That's 30 years from now, and how one could produce how the country, the 50 consecutive states, could reduce the carbon imprint. Number of things: electrifying and lessening auto cars, and at the same time dealing with electrification. NPR had an interesting program about futurism. I as a young person, had our Buckminster Fuller. He was a futurist. Was very popular in the 60s, and we subscribed to much. You can Bucky Fuller. You can read his books. Anyway, I had the pleasure of going to a seminar he had in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My first time up there. And it was, for a young man at the time, it was very intriguing. But this is basically what she's talking about on the Green New Deal. Now, it's a non-binding resolution there. The reactionaries, including DJ Trump, have said, well, people would not be flying on airliners. Well, we have very many more of these Boeing aircraft falling out of the sky. People will not be riding or flying on aircraft. And the FAA in this country is looking at it, and perhaps some design changes in software, etc. But they have, China has suspended all of those particular 743, whatever it is. They have suspended those, and several other countries, I think Singapore and some others, you can't go into their airspace, looking at it here. So in other words, it's created a situation. Boeing's Stark, I used to live in it's a 737, I'm sorry. It has a best-selling and a growing global market. After two crashes, its reputation is at risk. I'm just reading from the Washington Post here. The Boeing 737 MAX 8 definitely has some problems. They are updating that system, flight control system. The only question we have is why they didn't update it before the crash. They had a crash in Ethiopia. They also had a crash where one went into the sea. So there are a number of crashes going on here, and now we're looking at it. There are questions after another story here from Boeing after the second deadly plane crash there, and so we'll look at it. The Post has a podcast on it, of all things. Anyway, and they also have, we'll get back to AOC here in a minute, the Trump budget. I'll just run that down. This is meant to be very short because we have sports. These are the different departments. Agriculture at $20.8 billion. The change will be $3.6 billion from the 2019 budget. It was $24.4 billion there. Defense will get $718.3 billion, and a change in the positive of $33.3 billion, getting close to $1 trillion every day. The education budget the last time around was at roughly $70 billion. This time around it'd be at $62 billion. That is $8.8 billion less. Department of Energy, $31 billion, 31 actually 0.7. That is a change of $3.8 billion. Department of Health and Human Services, he proposes to cut it by $12.4 billion. Homeland Security, add $3.6 billion to it. Department of Housing Urban Development, $8.6 billion less there. The Interior Department, $2 billion less. Department of Justice, 0.7 billion there in the Department of Justice. Department of Labor, 1.2 billion there. The State Department, USAID, those are the people that are engaged in in Venezuela. The failed food drop there at $12.5 billion. At Transportation Department, a cut of $5.1 billion. And the Treasury Department, $2.2 billion there. Veteran Affairs, he's actually adding $6.8 billion. Now that is an ever decreasing amount of people. The largest contingent of them being Vietnam era veterans who are my age or older, and that number will decrease. And lastly here is NASA, taking out $0.5 billion from NASA. It was 21.5 last time around. $1 billion there. So that is the budget of DJ Trump. One of the big item people have been talking about, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, basically said there that Trump is not worth for impeaching. She gave an interview to the Washington Post, looking at a small placard given to her by Representative Sherry Bezos. She's from Illinois. It's a placard of a young Abraham Lincoln. She's 78 years old and never thought that Donald Trump would be elected, but in many ways she has been preparing for this political battle all life. She's been around since 1987. She's in her 17th term now, a very long time in the House. After 8 years as minority leader, what does it mean for you to be back in office? Of course, she laughed there. She is back there. We have H.R. 1 on the floor, and in the first 100 days we have introduced, have had introductions, hearings, markups, etc., lowering healthcare costs, building infrastructure, bigger paychecks than guns, dreamers, Equity Act, and equal pay. She goes on to say, DJ Trump has been a great organizer for Democrats, a great fundraiser for Democrats, a great mobilizer of the grassroots level, on the grassroots level for the Democrats. It's what is the most divisive political climate in your 32 years in Congress? She says it's very divisive because of the person who's in the White House and the enablers that the Republicans in Congress are to him. It was terrible when we were in the 90s. That's when they had old Newt Gingrich was the Speaker and impeached Bill Clinton. There was no question that it was horrible for the country. It was unnecessary and the rest. But in terms of where we are, as Thomas Paine would say, the time has found us, and the time has found us now. We have very serious challenges to the Constitution of the United States and in the presidency on constitutional assault on the Constitution and on the first branch of government, the legislative branch. This is very serious for the country, on forgiving politics, on forgiving partisanship. Just talk about patriotism. So in terms of divisiveness, that we don't see a commensurate, I don't want to say reaction, but just action on the part of the Republicans to the statements and actions of the President is taking. For 2020, your goal is to keep the Democrats in control of the House. Well, every election we say is very important, and just to get more critical times. In 16, I never thought he would be elected president. How could it be? The election is very important. I don't think he'll be reelected, but it's important for us to elect a Democratic president, Senate, and House. Very hard to do. Would you describe your relationship with the president? She just laughed. We'll leave it at that. There's increasing calls, including from some of your members, for impeachment of the president. She just said, I'm not for impeachment. We'll leave it at that. You've heard reports there. So you're on the cover of Rolling Stone with Representative John R. Hayes. That's from Connecticut, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which this report's about, and Ilhan Omar. Do you see this new generation of women lawmakers, not just then, but this generation, do you see yourself in them? Here's what I see myself in them as. When I came to Congress, I had no intention of running for office. A shy person I had been. I was chair of the California Democratic Party, always advancing other people. I love that because I cared much about the cause of the Democratic Party. My motivation is the 1 in 5 children who live in poverty in the U.S. Very noble there. So I decided to basically throw a hat in the ring. you can get results, or they're trying to impact other decision making. Now you're the person. So my being a progressive, a liberal from San Francisco, she's originally from Baltimore, and we're kind of moving this along here. It's Ash Wednesday, and you're a Protestant Catholic. How do you faith guide you in office? I was born into a family that was devoted Catholics, fiercely patriotic and proud of our Italian ancestry, and staunchly Democrat. We saw the connection between church and Democrats as the Gospel of Matthew. When Trump was asking for money for the border, why was it so essential for the Democrats to not give it to him? Because it was wrong. We'll leave it there. The president uses a message of fear against immigrants, against trade, against Hillary Clinton. You said earlier you don't feel it's worth it to impeach. Do you believe he's fit to be a president? Are we talking ethically, intellectually, or politically? All of the above. And she's been quoted as saying that one of the proposals that have drawn a lot of attention and some support for Democrats is the idea of the Green New Deal. I don't think anybody ever told me to get behind the plan. Here's the thing. When I was Speaker, the first time my flagship issue was climate energy, and working with President Bush to pass the biggest energy bill in the history of the country, the equivalent of taking millions of cars off the road by raising emission standards and the CAFE, C-A-F-E. We came to the conclusion we passed a big bill based on many of President Obama's initiatives to protect the environment and honor what we agreed to in Paris. In fact, the Green New Deal raises the profile of the issue. That's really important, but any proposal that someone has to come through the committee process. She's an old committee process person. The late John McCain talked about this, the idea of committees having hearings, etc. Yodala Alexandria said in an interview, she knows what you're doing, and that she would make you, and that should make you sleep at night, knowing that at least somebody in this town knows what you're doing. How well do you sleep at night? It depends on how much chocolate I eat during the day. I have a donut for breakfast and totally forget it until the chocolate donut. Anyway, there. So, in the effort to liven the interview up, let me go back to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez here. She was at South by Southwest speaking before a 1,000-strong audience about a multitude of topics, including the intersect of race, class, and identity politics. The panel concluded with questions from the audience, and Bill Nye the Science Guy, you'll hear him, got up there. As you may know, I'm a white guy. Nye began his address to AOC. I belong to two unions. I think the problem on both sides is fear. People of my ancestry are afraid of having to pay for everything as immigrants come into the country. People who work at the diner in Alabama are afraid to try to ask for what is reasonable. So you do have a plan to work with people in Congress and that are afraid. Nye said this fear relates particularly to climate change and Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which promotes the programs of science and useful arts by securing for limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. I think one of the keys to dismantling fear is dismantling zero-sum mentality. That's how Ocasio-Cortez began, and what she would be a lengthy response. What do you mean? It means rejecting outright the logic that says that says that someone else gains a necessity by my loss, and my gain must necessitate someone else's loss. That's a zero sum. It must come at a cost to another person. We increase our capacity for production. We can give without a take. And that's an old line of belief there of American ragged individualism. We are viewing progress as a cost instead of as an investment. She said The difference between a cost and an investment is an investment yields return. And when we choose to invest in our system, we are choosing to create wealth. And when we all invest in them, the wealth is for all of us too. She encouraged panel attendees to engage year-round in local government. If you wish to see change, urge them to call their Congress types, Congresswoman, in the same regularity as they call their neighborhood Chinese restaurant for takeout. I think probably in Austin it would be a Latino restaurant. Anyway, by holding their elected officials accountable, AOC said these people can affect a change. AOC, incidentally, was an organizer in Austin, Texas. Courage is self-propagating, she said. So the first person who stands up to encounter the most amount of fear and discomfort, but once the person stands up, it becomes immensely easier for the second, third, fourth, and so on. Until it does, it doesn't take any courage to stand up for something and do something else. So, what would I say is the biggest antidote to fear? When you see something that is being fearful, is to choose to be the person that is courageous. Her appearance, no doubt, was a mob scene as how they end up their part of it. And I won't do this one. What I will say, Joe Lunchbox Biden appeared or is appearing before the Firefighters Union. I think that's later today, where Lunchbox will lay out his plan. He's supposedly over 95% to run. I'm not sure why he's generating all the excitement. Well, I am sure. What that does is a DJ Trump stunt. What that does is encourage the media to write more stories about Joe Lunchbox Biden. Therefore, less money he will have to pay on media. People know who Lunchbox is. He's been around a very long time, and he's vice president for 8 years. He's leading in the horse race in all the polls I've seen at the present time. How he will affect other candidates, such as Amy Klobuchar, etc., when he enters, we'll look at the polls and see. But those people are in the single digits. They're trying to set the horse race up. This is a corporate meteor between he and Bernie Sanders. Was he and Bernie Sanders are in their 70s. I think Bernie's 77, he's 76. DJ Trump is either 72 or 73. All these fellows are in their 70s. So if you set that up, you don't have the question of age about either one. Is a way to go if you want to go in that direction. But some of the single-digit candidates, we don't know how they will fare. But if we look at the betting side here, I'll look at it very, very quickly and go to sports if I can find it as quickly as we want to find it. Yeah, let's see. Said the blind man to the bee. No. Here we go. This is predicted. Bernie Sanders is at 26%, 26 cents. Excuse me, he's won at 1 penny. Joe Biden is at 25 cents. Kamala Harris is at 16 cents, and Beto O'Rourke is also at 16 cents if you want to bet. And you can go to that site. And the others are 8 centers. Well, Andrew Yang, he's at 8 cents. I'm surprised about that. And Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar are at 6 cents. And you can go up there and throw in the best offer, yes. And it says what it is. I thought we'd just put that in so people would see where it goes. There also was a dialogue over the weekend between Mike Pence. We'll bring this to a different show. And the former vice president and war criminal Cheney, where basically Pence, this was American Enterprise Institute at Sea Island, Georgia, where Cheney is walking the line of, I guess we can do it now, of Wilsonian foreign policy. And he basically goes on to say, I worry that the bottom line of that kind of approach is we have an administration that looks more like Barack Obama than Ronald Reagan. Well, that's impossible. Cheney words are allowed to Pence. We are getting in a situation when our friends and allies around the world that we depend on are going to lack confidence in us, and then often a blunt criticism of the current administration response to foreign policy changes. Cheney is increasingly balked at DJ Trump's engagement in the Mideast and pulling out of Syria, in other words, and on the Korean Peninsula. So this is basically the chat here. We threw it up on Facebook there, and the exercises with the Republic of Korea, President's directive to pursue a policy that would insist that Germany, Japan, and South Korea pay the total costs for our deployment there, plus 50% on top of that. That has been a free ride, and those countries are self-sufficient. So there are some positives in old DJ Trump's bottom line, so to speak. Anyway, on to the NBA here. Last night, the Raptors were in Cleveland. Cleveland 126 to 101. The Wizards beat the Kings 121 to 115. The Pistons were beaten by the Nets 103 to 75. The Hornets were beaten by the Rockets 118 to 106. The Thunder beat the Jazz in Utah 98 to 89. And finally, the Celtics were in Los Angeles, and the Clippers won the game 140 to 115. On to Major League Baseball, which is spring training. We're starting to tune into some games. The Tigers shut out the Twins. The Mets lost to the Astros 6-3. The Pirates were beaten by Atlanta 6-2. The Rays beat the Phillies 8-2. The Nationals were beaten by the Cardinals 3-2. The Angels beat in a high slugging game the Rangers 12 to 11. The White Sox and Brewers 8-5 there. The Brewers will have a Democratic convention, and a 5-5 tie with the Reds and Cleveland. Giants and Dodgers, a game I tuned into. Finally, the Giants prevailed 4-1. The Dodgers were ahead in the early innings. The Athletics and Rockies 6-3. Kansas City beat the Mariners 5-1, and in the second squad game, I should say, final in 5, the Rangers beat the Royals 6-2. On to the National Hockey League, the Lightning and Maple Leafs. The Lightning 6-2. The Islanders shut out the Blue Jackets 2-0. The Flyers beat the Senators 3-2. The Sharks beat the Wild 3-0. The Coyotes were beaten by the Blackhawks in Chicago 7-1. The Hurricanes beat the Avalanche 3-0. I hope you like my zip. And the Rangers in an overtime were beaten by the Oilers 3-2. In the NCAA men's basketball, there were two games, Pepperdine and Gonzaga. It was Gonzaga 100-74. And the other game, UNC Greensboro and Wofford. Look at Wofford in here quite a bit. 70-58 Wofford in the men's part. And to the women's part, well, we had some clinches here. Baylor beat Iowa State to win with the Big Four quarter to win the Big 12 conference. And Mississippi State jumped to a number 1 seed. There, we're moving towards March Madness. In other words, the Oregon Ducks' chance for number 1 seed fell short against Stanford, and Stanford took home another Pac-12 title. And Notre Dame beat Louisville for the ACC title, and The women's bracket, Ohio replaced TCU as the last team. So some things here. Anyway, let's get the scores here quickly. That's that Iowa State Baylor. It was Baylor 67-49. UFC and UConn 66-45. In overtime with Gonzaga over St. Mary's by 1 point, 78-77. And finally Georgetown and Marquette. Marquette is incidentally in Milwaukee, 75-62. And one final note here, in Kentucky, we covered Kentucky incidentally. The lawmakers blinked, this is from the Public News Service incidentally, add a bill to prohibit the use of tobacco products on school property, reducing students' exposure to secondhand smoke. The bill is still a chance. That's House Bill 11. Could pass the House and move to the Senate, but the bill currently awaits a vote by the full House. Bill Chandler, he's president of Healthy Kentucky, said he thinks a cultural shift around the acceptance of tobacco's long use is overdue. It costs us enormous amounts of money economically throughout the state, Chandler said, and businesses won't locate in Kentucky when you have a smoking rate that is as high as ours, a tobacco state, no doubt. According to the American Lung Association, around 9,000 Kentuckians die annually from smoke-related diseases. Health and other costs there are estimated to set the Commonwealth of Kentucky back $2 billion a year, quite a bit of money. Another bill would make it harder for kids to gain access to cigarettes and e-cigarettes by raising the age to 21. That is Senate Bill 249. Dr. Terry Brooks, Executive Director of the Youth Advocates, said the Chamber of Commerce Medical Association, even Big Tobacco, supports raising the age of 21. Maybe they think it won't happen. You really have a rare constellation of allies here, according to Dr. Brooks. Anyway, we go on to AOC. I can get the name right. Same as a monitor. We used to sell AOC monitors. Anyway, the monitor on our program here, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at Southwest by Southwest. And the special guest says Bill Nye, the climate guy. Good day.
Direct it to a negative and destructive end that allows a small group of people to benefit a great amount, or you have to take a really bold stances to bring it the other way and direct it to the possibility of what we can accomplish together. And I think the thing that is really hard for people to sometimes see is that when we are on this path of a slow erosion and a slow, just like move away from what we've always been, we'll be 100 miles. You won't even realize that you've drifted 100 miles. So when someone's talking about our core, it's like, oh, this is radical. But this isn't radical. This is what we've always been. Mm-hmm. It's just that now we've strayed so far away from what has really made us powerful. And just and good and equitable and productive. And so I think all of these things sound radical compared to where we are, but where we are is not a good thing. And this idea of like 10% better from garbage shouldn't be what we settle for. It's like this, like, it feels like moderate is not a stance, it's just an attitude toward life of like,
Well, don't hold back. Tell me how you really feel about incrementalism.
But here's the thing that upsets me is that we've become so cynical that we view or we view cynicism as an intellectually superior attitude, and we view ambition as youthful naivete. when we think about the greatest things we have ever accomplished as a society have been ambitious acts of vision. And the meh is like worship now for what? Like for what?
I like to joke that incrementalism has ruined my dating life because I have been on several dates now where people have argued with me, not any ideological measure per se, but the pure merits of incrementalism. And what I find myself doing in response is often evoking some of the themes that I think make your approach so powerful, which is to foreground the moral question and to ask, if we say that X, Y, and Z is going to take so many years, if climate change is a great example because we've now been told we don't have but 12 years, right? Who actually is hurt by kicking the can down the road?
That's right.
Because there was a lot of conversation in 2016 about how irresponsible or naive it was to pursue some of these big ticket items, and not a lot of conversation about the privilege that it takes to say, well, we'll deal with this in the next generation. So I do want to connect this back a little bit more to the issues involving race, because while I think that there is a great deal of popularity, these programs are, poll after poll show, overwhelmingly popular. There is this emergent narrative that says these kind of New Deal style universal programs are not for diverse communities, and that there's a lot of skepticism that I think is understandable among certain non-white communities that says, well, these programs were floated before. They did a lot to fix a lot of people, help a lot of people in America, but they systemically cut out us.
Yeah.
We weren't able to take advantage of them in the same way, and they had the effect of widening the wealth gap and other kinds of gaps. So how do we connect the utility of these kind of New Deal programs to communities that feel like they have been insufficiently served by them in the past?
And that's an excellent question, because it was one of the founding questions with which we started approaching the draft of the Green New Deal resolution. Because one of the things about history is that it is often revisionist. Martin Luther King is cast as this angelic person that never made anyone mad and just asked for civil rights and got it. And unions were always just seen as like this great, powerful thing that nobody died for a 40-hour work week and a weekend. And it's a similar thing, the other way with the New Deal is that we act as though the New Deal wasn't racist. And the New Deal was an extremely economically racist policy that drew literal red lines around Black and brown communities. And basically, it invested in white America. And what it did was that it allowed white Americans to have access to home loans that Black and brown Americans did not have access to, giving them the largest form of intergenerational wealth, which is real estate. And so this has really, it really accelerated many parts of an already horrific racial wealth gap that continues to persist today. So how do we turn this around? And what we did with the Green New Deal is, this is why the intersectional frontline community aspect of the Green New Deal is so important, because it allows indigenous communities to lead, Black and brown communities to have a certain self-determination that has not existed in public policy for these communities before. And so one of the ways that we do that is we say we fix the pipes in Flint first. We clean the air in the Bronx first. We rebuild the electrical grids in Puerto Rico, and we fully fund and we fully fund the pensions of coal miners in West Virginia at the same time. And the reason that we do these things is because the truth of the matter is that economically, civically, and beyond, our destinies and our prosperity and our well-being is tied. It's inextricably linked. And when we pursue public policy in a way that unlinks us from each other, it is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. Eventually, it catches up to you. And it catches up to you in racial resentment, and that racial resentment is a political tool to dismantle the economic advocacy that we need to have for ourselves.
So I think your point about how important intersectionality is in the design of these new deal programs is really well made. But I think there's this interesting debate that's happening where instead of arguing that programs, so-called universal programs, should be designed to avoid the mistakes of the past so that they should be more intersectional, there is a rising skepticism of them on the whole, and a feeling that instead of those programs, marginalized communities would be better served by programs that are racially specific, like racially targeted programs that would put resolving race gaps first. And I think that raises a really obvious political conundrum, even if kind of the ethical concerns are, one would have empathy for them, right? So the political conundrum is that if we live in a country that's still 70% white, which is a number that I think shocks a lot of people, but if you include white Hispanics, it actually is that big, who often vote similarly to non-Hispanic whites. What is a political cost, let's say, of saying we're going to throw your hat in with a program like reparations? How much do you think those considerations should be made?
Well, it's a good question. I think that one of the things that we've seen from early polling actually is that I think that we should distance ourselves and start getting away from this idea that we should only care about ourselves. Because when we really do start to assert and believe and understand and see how our destinies are tied, we kind of get away from this idea that only people of color care about other people of color and only white people care about other white people and so on. There are a lot of systems that we have to dismantle, but also it does get into this interesting area of where we are as a country about identity, because what does it mean to be black? Who is black and who isn't, especially as our country becomes more biracial and multiracial. Same thing with being Latino. Same thing. It brings up all these questions of passing and things like that. But I do think it is important that we have to have substantive conversations about race beyond what is racist and what is not. And if someone says something racist, does that make them racist? We need to get away from talking. Well, not that we have to get away from talking about racism. It's important that we talk about racism, but because we talk about racism so much, we actually aren't talking about race itself. And we aren't educating ourselves about our own history to come to the conclusions that I think we need to come to. One of the frustrations, those of you who are familiar with my Twitter feed know that I'm very online. And one of the recurring frustrations that I have is the way in which the idea of a race-class divide erases the extent to which the biggest concerns, in my view anyway, when we talk about racism and the negative effects of racism, what we're really talking about are, one, the kind of interpersonal slight and the feeling of marginalization and those kind of psychic harms, but more significantly, more often, we're talking about the effects, which are often economic, and how kind of absurd it feels to be to say that a conversation about closing the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, is somehow a conversation that falls into one category, either race or class, or that if we're talking about housing integration, that somehow that isn't also a class issue. And, it feels like not a lot of people are doing a particularly good job of connecting the extent to which kind of class equality efforts are, in fact, inextricably entwined with racial equality efforts, no matter what, as a matter of course, definitionally.
what kind of, do you have any sense of what kind of messaging is effective there?
I actually think that it goes beyond messaging, and it's really just about education. So like a lot of people don't know this story about the New Deal. A lot of people don't know what redlining is. And because of that, it's just like, I don't know why there is a racial wealth gap. And because when people are not educated about the tools and the systems that created racial wealth gap disparities or other wealth gap disparities, it's just like, this is the reality, I don't know. And you create this gaping maw in which someone can tell a racist story that kind of tells people why a certain community is poor. They're poor because they're lazy, they're poor because they're uneducated, they're poor because this, but no one's saying they're poor because they're redlining and everyone else inherited a house except for, people of color.
Yeah.
And so
I got no house.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think a lot of it is part of our personal responsibility to educate ourselves and to get past the revisionist history that we're taught in the 4th grade. And so that's, I think that's an important part, but also the messaging is important as well, in that it doesn't feel good to live in an unequal society. It doesn't feel good. I walk through New York City, which has the highest rate of people who are homeless today than in any other time since the Great Depression. And at the same time, there are penthouses galore, 50% of which are vacant because they're people's second or third or fourth home. And it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good walking down New York City and walking and seeing so many veterans who are homeless, so many elderly who are homeless, and so on, people with mental illnesses that are homeless. It doesn't feel good to live in a society like that. And so part of it, I think, does go back to the moral question. It's and that's where, you're also able to combat that incrementalism, because it's we're talking, for example, with ICE. I've stated very, very clearly, I don't believe that an agency that systematically and repeatedly violates human rights can be reformed. I think it must be abolished. Mm-hmm. And I got a lot of heat recently in the party because I was really furious when this Republican amendment was able to kind of slip through on a gun safety bill that gave more power to ICE. It allowed gun vendors to report information about undocumented people to ICE. And I was furious about it, and I got a lot of heat for being furious about it because, whatever reason. And so, but the thing is, the reason that I was so upset is because we have an agency that is separating children from their parents and putting them in cages. And CNN was reporting a year ago, CNN had reports of ICE agents pinning down children and forcibly injecting them with antipsychotic drugs. And the thing that makes me furious is this idea of let's just cage a few less. Let's just inject a few less. Let's just, it's too politically complicated. And for me, what is just so upsetting and heartbreaking about this moment is since when did it become the moderate position in America to continue caging children? And that's why we're not talking about the difference between a 7 and a 10% tax rate. We're not talking about percentage points. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about children. We're talking about what kind of nation we want to be, and this idea that it's electorally complicated because we have allowed racial resentment to become legitimized as a political tool is a very difficult thing to grapple with.
Right. So you mentioned, one of the things you said about ICE is that, if something is structurally irredeemable, then we shouldn't be having conversations about redeeming it. You know, majorities of Americans, I think for the first time, a majority of more Americans feel favorably about socialism than capitalism. And increasingly, there are these kind of systemic critiques of capitalism. Do you feel similarly that our system of government is irredeemable? I mean, you've said in the past, you know, you don't think it's ethical to have a country with billionaires where there were so many people who are, you know, struggling to get their basic healthcare needs met. You know, at what point does that translate into a broader systemic critique of the country and a critique of what kind of leaders we should be electing going forward?
I don't think that our government is irredeemable. If I did, I wouldn't have run for office.
But capitalism in particular, right? Because it could be different.
So I think the tough part about this, about like, is capitalism redeemable, etc., is that it's hard to have these conversations, I think, as a society, because we all have different ideas of what, just in the public imagination, there are different ideas of what does capitalism mean, what does socialism mean, etc. But for me, when I think about what those definitions are, capitalism to me, it's an ideology of capital. It puts capital, the most important thing is the concentration of capital, and it means that we seek and prioritize profit and the accumulation of money above all else, and we seek it at any human and environmental cost. That is what that means. And to me, that ideology is not sustainable and cannot be redeemed. But when we talk about ideas, for example, like democratic socialism, it means putting democracy and society first instead of capital first. It doesn't mean that you put other things last. It doesn't mean that the actual concept of capital as a society should be abolished or anything like that. But it's a question of our priorities. And right now, I think what we are reckoning with are the consequences of putting profit above everything else in society. Because what it means is people getting paid less than what it takes to live. What it means is people that need insulin die because they can't afford it, even though us as a society can afford it, and also because insulin was originally made free, because the idea of having to pay to live seemed crazy, even to the people who discovered it. And so for me, it's a question of priorities, and right now I don't think our priorities are sustainable. But there's also, again, in the public imagination, a lot of fear-mongering about what democratic socialism means, that it's like, that government's going to like take over the private sector. And in fact, in my opinion, those two things need to be separate. And what we're actually experiencing right now is the opposite. What we are experiencing is, just as there's all of this fear-mongering that government is going to take over every corporation and government is going to take over every business or every form of production, we should be scared right now because corporations have taken over our government. And in my opinion, we should be wary of any entity in which both of those things are combined, whether it's through one way or the other. And that's why the emphasis in democratic socialism is on democracy. And it's not about, it's just as much a transformation about bringing democracy to the workplace, so that we have a say and that we don't check all of our rights at the door every time we cross the threshold into our workplace. Because at the end of the day, as workers and as people of society, we're the ones creating wealth, not a corporate CEO. It's not a CEO that's actually creating $4 billion a year. It is the millions of workers in this country that's creating billions of dollars of economic productivity a year. And our system should reflect that.
So I think as controversial, as debated rather, as the definition of democratic socialism, I think is probably also the definition of identity politics. And in this last few minutes, I really do want to get to this because you did an interview with Glenn Greenwald for The Intercept last summer in which you gave perhaps the most eloquent description of identity politics that I've ever heard as someone who is 100% on the identity politics beat. So I want to, if we can, play a short part of that clip.
At the end of the day, I'm a candidate that doesn't take corporate money, that champions Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee, the abolishment of ICE, and a Green New Deal. But I approach those issues with the lenses of the community that I live in. And that is not as easy to say as identity politics, but I think it's something that our constituents understand on a very deep level.
So what I love about that definition, and there was a lot before, but I would rather you talk about it here live than go back to a year-old clip, is that I think, united two kind of different definitions that have been percolating that I think cause a lot of the debate. There is a critique of identity politics from the right, which says identity doesn't matter. It's all about kind of rugged individualism, and there's to say that there are experiences that people have because of what they look like, how they identify, how the world interacts with them, is silly or wrong, despite the fact that I think that doesn't accord with most people's lived experiences, right? You know that when you walk through the world wearing a space helmet on, that people are going to react to you like you're wearing a space helmet, and the same comes from other kinds of, more substantive identities. There's also this critique of weaponized identity, though, which is, I think, the critique that more often comes from the left, which says, the fact of somebody's identity might be a proxy for their beliefs or their politics, but is not determinative. And that particularly when we're looking at politicians and kind of picking our leadership, that it's important to keep both of those things in mind, to say, okay, representation has value, the lens has value, but the lens is a lens as opposed to kind of, like an eye patch or a blind or something that completely cuts off vision. I mean, how do you negotiate the balance between, I think, a genuine desire for representation and a desire also to have substantive politics that don't always map on to politicians who possess marginalized identities?
Yeah, I feel like my perspective on this was really shaped by where I came from in the Bronx, because it took so much effort in my community, burned so many times, and they've been burned by politicians that look like them. And so in the Bronx, there's just this idea, that it's just like, it really doesn't matter. And there's all of this cynicism that resulted from electing people, that ethnically matched the community, but once they got into power, advanced the same agenda that was marginalizing the community to begin with. And so there was a lot of cynicism about that. And the thing that creates hope about the situation is the joining of the two things, is that you can have someone from the community that understands the experience actually advocate for the policies and the positions that can change our future. So they're not, separable things. I don't think that I truly do not believe that if I ran on a platform that was more moderate, I would not have won my election. I wouldn't have. And thanks. And because it has to be not just a superficial alternative or something that looks different. It has to be something that actually is different. And it has to be different on many levels. Yes, it's different in my identity, and my identity and my experiences with my community inform and add, a different perspective to the positions that I hold and to the policy that I hold. Because it goes the other way, because you can't have just a progressive position like Medicare for all without an understanding of race, because then you do get back to that position that you were talking about earlier, where communities say, oh, this isn't for me. This is for somebody else. People aren't thinking about me when you're drafting this plan, and because you aren't thinking about me, then when it gets implemented, we're going to get left behind again. And it's going to be a benefit for somebody else. And so to be able to articulate both of these things, both of these arguments at once, to be able to talk about how criminal justice reform, or rather like the war on drugs, was an economic agenda, it educates people. And that's really what we need. We really just need to be educating ourselves right now about how we've gotten to this place.
Well, I would love to keep asking you a lot more questions, but I think I've been told to reserve 15 minutes for the audience. So does anybody have a question? Yes, down in front.
Hi, same.
So the question is, for anybody who didn't hear, how do you talk to people with kind of different beliefs about racism and feminism and broader political beliefs?
So the way I have conversations with people of opposing beliefs is I don't try to convince them of anything. So that's the first thing. Stop trying to win people over. Stop trying to enter a conversation thinking that you're going to aha them into changing their mind. And so I think that, we've kind of lost the art of conversation. So when I enter a conversation with someone, I actually try to learn more about where they're coming from. I actually use it as an experience to, let's say I'm talking to someone who's saying something really racist and they don't even realize that they're saying something really racist. I ask them questions because I'm interested. I'm fascinated by that. How does that work, but really, and so I don't do it in a way that's mocking, but I ask questions to kind of dig, when someone says, oh, this isn't racist, why? But we have to learn to really disarm ourselves in these conversations, first of all, because we approach them with so much hostility and they get mad and we get mad and all of these things. So part of it is emotional work. And the second part of it is intention. What are you trying to get out of this conversation? And if you're just trying to argue with someone, it's not going to work. You believe what you believe, they believe what they believe. So I think the thing that we have to do is try to have a good faith interaction of trying to learn more about where the other person comes from. Because often what I find is that when I do win people over, it's almost never in the conversation itself that I've won someone over. It's that I have a conversation with someone, I ask them some critical questions, and I pretty calmly explain to them, well, this is where I'm coming from, and this is why I believe what I believe. Why do you believe what you believe? And you kind of leave the conversation, but very often that person will sit on what you said, and they will sit on the fact that you respected them and gave them space. And then very often I've had interactions like that, and I'll run into that person again a week later, a month later, etc. And they said, you know what? You said something that I really thought about and I changed my mind. But no one ever changes their mind in the actual acute situation of a conversation. It's afterwards when it kind of sits with them. But if you rush in, fully armored up, attacking them and making them feel defensive, they will never listen to anything that you have to say. So it's really about learning how we can have a conversation again. And also there's a really important conversation about good faith and bad faith conversations. And when I sense that someone is engaging in me in bad faith, I just don't engage the conversation at all. It's not worth my time or my energy. If someone's trying to put you down or belittle you or approach a conversation as though they are more intelligent than you, because oh no, there's no way that someone can disagree with me and still be smart. There's this there's this very condescending tone that we have in a lot of our conversations. And I think it's important to really approach those kinds of disagreements with a lot of compassion, because when they see that, people really look at not just the logic of your argument, but how you make them feel. As much as people hate to say that and admit it, it's true.
Yeah, I think that's good advice and really hard advice, because I think there's a lot of talk about kind of emotional labor. Yeah. The idea of having to put out emotional labor is controversial, right? Because nobody should have to. But I think the reality is that if you don't approach these conversations in a certain kind of way, you don't get the results that you'd like. And I do find I found myself in these conversations a lot when I'm traveling around doing reporting trips around the country, and was once in a car with a bunch of other not white reporters, where the Uber drivers started saying some things that were like a little less than kosher. And everyone jumped in and kind of, I think, in my defense is what it was about. And I was like, we've got 44 minutes till we get to Des Moines, and I need this not to escalate. And what ended up happening was that giving the driver a little bit more space, he basically talked himself out of his own racism using I needed to give him enough rope.
That's right. That's right. I was just, Austin's a very special place for me because this is one of the first places where I actually organized young people. And I have this mentor, and one of the best pieces of advice that he gave me is always give someone the golden gate of retreat, which is give someone enough rope, give someone enough compassion, enough opportunity in a conversation for them to look good changing their mind.
Yeah.
And it's a really important thing to be able to do, because if you're just like, oh, you said this thing, like, you're racist, and when now you're forcing that person to say, no, I'm not, like, etc., there's no golden gate of retreat there. Yeah. The only retreat there is to just barrel right through the opposing opinion.
Yeah. I'm sorry I missed the line over there at the mic.
Because it's brand new.
Yeah, yay.
I count the days that Donald Trump will not be my president, which will hopefully be tomorrow, but I think it's not. Sorry. I think it's not going to be until 2020. My problem is I look at everyone and I have a hard time choosing someone I believe in versus just choosing someone that will win. And at what point will we have a candidate we all believe in versus just getting ahead and getting that win so he's not president?
That's an excellent question. A lot of, I think the person we believe in is the person who will win. And so I think that even if who we believe in is different, I think that in this first initial stage, we have a responsibility to find and really fight for who we believe in. Because what people, my opinion, and I think we've seen, what people think will win is wrong. Almost always. What people think, they'll say, oh, I believe X, Y, Z, but I think the thing that will win is something other than what I believe. And so everyone starts like triangulating what they think will win away from what they actually believe, and compromising all of the things that make them passionate about participating in our political system, until we have this weird compromise, like this weird amalgamation, which is like how we've gotten a lot of the politicians that we've gotten, and a lot of the complaints about politicians that we've gotten today, how everyone talks like a robot, that everything is prescripted, that they're either like super out of touch. Like, this is how we got this. We take responsibility because we voted for these people. Like, they didn't come out of nowhere. We voted for these people that we don't like. So if you're complaining about the system, it's because we're not fighting hard enough for what we actually believe in, because we do idolize like cynicism as an intellectually superior position, and we're like, oh, it's small of me, or it's, the child in me that believes we can have health care as a human right.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should belittle our beliefs anymore. Like, we are capable of so much as a country. And we are capable of so much than what we're doing right now. Like, we are capable of everything in the world. We are capable of saving the planet, of guaranteeing healthcare as a right, of educating our children through college. We are capable of establishing all work as dignified, of respecting people's cultures, of having an economy that not only welcomes immigrants, but needs immigrants because we are being so productive. We are capable of all of these things. We're capable of that. And like, don't get duped by this person that's like, oh, blah, 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 the technocratic. No, we are capable of them. And the position should be not, let's not do it because we haven't figured out all the details yet. How about the goal is let's figure out all the details because we've decided we're going to the moon and we're going to get there before the end of the decade, and then we're going to do it. This is the thing. It's like when Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon by the end of 10 years, people thought that he was crazy. He didn't have a plan. So many of the technologies that required us to get there weren't even invented yet, but it was taken seriously enough as a mission. Like, we need to think of platform positions as well as our mission. And it should be our mission right now to make sure that all people have health care. It should be our mission right now. Our mission should be to make sure that all jobs are paid a dignified living wage. And then our mission should be to save our freaking planet. And the New York Times said, and I quote, they said in a headline, the Green New Deal is technologically possible, but is it politically possible? And so that to me is the biggest, condemnation of where we're at, because there is an actual admission that we can do it. And just the idea that our biggest obstacle is political will should be the most embarrassing thing for us right now.
Hi. First of all, I saw you at Foley Square on Women's March. It was really awesome. My name is Yale. I am a first-generation immigrant. I wasn't even going to say that, but cool. As a tech entrepreneur as well, I do think every day about automation and the millions of jobs that are going to be replaced by machines in the coming decades, and how will we as a society be able to ensure that everyone can still earn a living or even find a purpose in an economy that will not be able to support as many jobs?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I think when we talk about automation, it's not just automating people out of work, but it's automating every system that we have right now. And what it also means is automating injustice. So when we talk about the trend of economic inequality, it's only going to accelerate with the advancement of technology if we don't fix our underlying systems. So if we don't fix our actual systems and how we handle the production of wealth, everybody should be feeling the fact that we are at our most prosperous point than we've ever been. Everybody in the country should be feeling the extent of our national prosperity, but the majority of us aren't. And so when we talk about the job automation, one of the things that's difficult is people should not we should not be haunted by the specter of being automated out of work, right? We should not feel nervous about the toll booth collector not having to collect tolls anymore. We should be excited by that. But the reason we're not excited by it is because we live in a society where if you don't have a job, you are left to die. And that is at its core our problem. And so there are a lot of different solutions or a lot of different proposed ideas about how we go about that. Bill Gates has talked about taxing robots at 90%. And what that means, what he's really talking about, is taxing corporations at 90%. But it's easier to say tax a robot. And so I think that what we do is, when we actually decouple ourselves from this idea, we should get to a point, and we should structure our systems, whether it's a tax rate, whether it's distributing wealth that is created by automation. If we approach solutions to our system and start entertaining ideas like that, then we should be excited about automation, because what it could potentially mean is more time educating ourselves, more time creating art, more time investing and investigating in the sciences, more time focused on invention, more time going to space, more time enjoying the world that we live in, because not all creativity needs to be bonded by wage. And I think that actually, one of the reasons that this ideology or questions of whether you want to call it democratic socialism or techno-futurism or whatever it is because our technological advancement as a society has outpaced our system for handling finite resources, because now we are approaching infinite resources. And capitalism is based on scarcity. And what happens when there is enough for everyone to eat? What happens when there is enough for everyone to be clothed? Then you have to make scarcity artificial. And that is what has happened. We have created artificial scarcity. And that is why we are driven to work 80 hours a week when we are being our most productive at any point in American history. And so we should be working the least amount we've ever worked if we were actually paid based on how much wealth we were producing. But we're not. We're paid on how little we're desperate enough to accept. And then the rest is skimmed off and given to a billionaire.
Yeah, I know that you grew up with Star Trek as well.
Yeah.
I like to think of it as full Star Trek socialism is the goal. I want to get through a few more of these questions quickly if we can.
Hi, my name is Lupita.
Hi, I'm Amia. We are the Radical Monarchs from East Oakland.
Hey! Are you wearing Girl Scout vests?
Yeah.
Oh, nice, cool.
Our question is, what advice would you give to young girls of color who want to get into politics?
Thank you. The advice that I give is stop trying to navigate systems of power and start building your own power. So, I represent Queens, and I was recently doing a town hall with Girls Who Code, and what I told them was that, there are so many subconscious forces that make us try to act like somebody else. And that's why it was important, and I've discussed this, that's why it was important for me to, wear hoop earrings to my swearing in, because we're taught that, when you're a woman of color, there are just so many things about you that is just non-conforming, I happen to have been, that's what I'm saying. It's I happen to have been born with straight hair, but my nieces have froze, right? And so down to that, there are places where you have to make more space, and we're taught to put our hair back and be small and articulate in a certain way and be square, and essentially try to do an impression of power, which has really our subconscious signals to try to act like white men. And so it's down to how you are kind of forced or encouraged to speak. the idea that some ways of speaking are less legitimate, the idea that some ways of dressing are less legitimate, or, instead we don't say legitimate, we say unprofessional. And so that if you say ain't, or if you say my mama, or whatever, it's unprofessional. But even if you're producing the same result or the same quality of work, you are somehow seen as less than. And so, so stop trying to navigate those systems, because they weren't built for you. And we need to build our own systems and recognize the other.
So we're out of time, but in light of how long the line is, I do want to do like a rapid fire. So if you keep your questions short and
I'll try to keep my answers
just a little bit shorter, then we can get through a few more people. So.
My name is Mike. I own a software company here in Austin. Majority of my staff are women, about 15. And in last election, a couple months ago, I noticed a lot of them actually didn't go to vote. And it really annoys me as somebody who's actually from Iran, from a country that is not easy to go, find a good candidate to vote for. So as an American, I want to tell you guys that please go vote.
Yes.
It matters. Every single one of them matters. How do I encourage my own staff, majority of them, again, younger, recent grad, how do I encourage them to go vote?
Tell them to run.
Thank you.
You got to tell them to run. You need to tell them to start participating even in small things like school boards and city councils and things like that, because I've had elections where I didn't want to vote. I didn't want to vote because I was like, this is not a good set of options. And so the answer is to get them to run.
Yeah, my name is Åsne Seierstad. I'm from Norway, and it's very interesting to have a European perspective and see from afar what your country is going through. I'm working down in Alabama in a diner, and what has changed Europe in the last century was more unions, labor unions, than tax policies. Here in the US, there's a lot of focus on tax policies. And these women in my diner, they're not organized, they're on minimum pay, they work by the hours, and they don't even think about organizing. They just, hope that they will get an extra hour work. How are you going to help people like them who don't really, don't really fight for themselves? I'm surprised by the submissiveness. Second question here is, when you hear the word socialism in the US, people would say this morning, Howard Schultz, socialism, what you talk about is Venezuela. In Europe, when we hear the word socialism, it's what Scandinavia is built on, even though you might call it social democracy. I'm just wondering, why don't candidates on the left here talk more forcefully about, yes, there is a model. There's a Nordic model in Europe, there's a Scandinavian model, Norwegian model, Swedish model. Instead of letting Fox News teach the people that what you're talking about, that's Venezuela.
So I'll start with the first half of your question, which has to do with organizing. And one of those things is because we have been taught that we don't matter in a lot of different subconscious ways. We've been taught that if you make $15 an hour, you don't matter. We've been taught that if you're poor, you don't matter. Taught if you're a person of color living in a community, you don't matter. And when you internalize and feel like you don't matter, you don't do anything to change your lot because you don't matter, because who cares? But so the core is really changing our idea of ourselves, that we matter and that our worthiness is not based on an external condition. Our worthiness is intrinsic to being a human being on this planet. And if you are alive and a human, then you are worth dignity. And that is, I think, the core tenet of organizing that needs to and is starting to, in my belief, awaken across the country. That's what we saw with teachers in West Virginia. That's what we saw in teachers in LA. That's what we're starting to see. That's why this is becoming the year of the strike, because people are starting to say, wait a second, I matter, and my dignity is not up for negotiation. With your second question about why we don't defend social democracy and from these bad faith attacks, I think it's because there's a lot of people that don't want us to have a social democracy, and they are in government, and they are also in the Democratic Party. And, I'm not allowed to say that. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble when I go back to work. But it's, I think that there are parts of it that are true. There's a lot of people, it's no secret in government, that go on this rotating door, and you would think that when someone leaves government, they would go back into a different form of public service, that they would become a professor, or they would organize a community, or they would work with unions. But now when politicians leave government, they go and work for lobbyists. And that tells you everything about the coordinated interests that are in cahoots all over, regardless of party. It's just, I guess the industries tend to be a little more partisan. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's just some people that don't want to defend it. There's some people that want to quiet down this idea, even within the Democratic Party, and then blame it on their constituents and say, they won't vote for that. Well, it's because we don't fight for it.
I think this has to be the last one, as we've gone over, but I think I recognize this.
Oh my gosh!
Greetings!
Hey!
Science! Yeah! Oh, wow! Wow, greetings, everyone!
Oh my goodness, this is amazing!
Greetings! This is so nice! It's good to see you all. I can't take selfies with everyone. Keep in mind, here's what I think's going on. I'll ask the question in two ways. As you may know, I'm a white guy. I belong to 2 unions.
Wow.
But I think the problem on both sides is fear.
Yep.
People are afraid, people of my ancestry are afraid of having to pay for everything when as immigrants come into this country. People who come in, the people who work at the diner in Alabama are afraid to try to ask for what is reasonable. Mm-hmm. So do you have a plan to work with people in Congress that are afraid? And I think that's what's going on with many of the conservatives, especially when it comes to climate change. Mm-hmm. People are just afraid of what will happen if we try to make these big changes. Mm-hmm. And I remind everyone, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the U.S. Constitution refers to the progress of science and useful arts. So when we address climate change, we're going to have clean water, access to the internet, and renewable electricity for everyone on Earth. Let's go!
Yes!
Thank you.
So, Bill. This is amazing. So I think one of the keys to dismantling fear is dismantling a zero-sum mentality. So that, I think, is a really important part of dismantling fear. So what does that mean? It means the rejection outright of the logic that says someone else's gain necessitates my loss, and that my gain must necessitate someone else's loss, that my gain must come at the cost of another person. We are increasing our capacities for productivity. And so we can give without a take, is where we're going through technologically. And when we say, this idea of how you're going to pay for it, this idea that there is a person that pays for it, instead of we're viewing progress as a cost instead of as an investment. And investments, the difference between a cost and an investment is that an investment yields returns. And when we choose to invest in our systems, we are choosing to create wealth. We are choosing to create wealth, and when we all invest in them, then the wealth is for all of us too. And so I think part of dismantling the fear is dismantling a zero-sum mentality. But, you know, it's not just about, like, this idea of who are our decision makers. It's that we, like, this is us. This is about voting. This is about the conversations that we're having with our elected officials, because I go there, and whether it's true or not, they blame all of it on you guys. They do. I go and I'm frustrated and I'll say, why did you weaken this environmental thing? And they say, my community doesn't want that. It's my district. You know, man, like, it's my district. And no one else, like, knows what anyone else's community is like, so they're like, oh, wow, that's weird, okay. And because to this day, I've never heard a person actually, like, level with me and be like, listen, my main donors are fossil fuel people and I just can't. No, but even in, like, the candor of an honest conversation, no one has said that to me. No one has ever said to me, listen, you know, I've got these really big donors, and to be really honest with you, this is why I can't do that. But we all know that's what's happening. And everyone blames it on their electorate. And when our electorate isn't speaking up, then they're allowed to get away with that. But when we decide to participate in this system, and what I talk about is not just in the on season, which is election time, but when we raucously participate in our system in the off season, in the governance time, when we participate in our own self-governance, not just our own elections, but our own governance, when we see what bills are coming to the floor, when we show up to the gallery in D.C., when we pick up the phone and call our congressman as much as we call our local, you know, Chinese spot for takeout, like, that's the kind of relationship we need to have, because once we start getting vocal, they can't get away with the excuse of my district doesn't want that anymore. And that's what we need to do. And one last thing about fear, you know, is I want to talk one thing, you know, in contrast to fear is to tell you something about courage. Mm-hmm. Because the thing about courage is that courage is self-propagating. Courage begets courage. So the first person who stands up has to encounter the most amount of fear and discomfort. But once that one person stands up, it becomes immensely easier for the second person and the third and the fourth, until it doesn't take any courage at all to stand up for something or to do something. And so what I would say is that the biggest antidote to fear is to, when you see someone that is being fearful, is to choose to be the person that is courageous, to show other people what courage looks like, to be the first person in the room to say, that's not right, or to be the person in the room, you know, when there's this conversation and the conversation starts to get taken over with fear-mongering, with, like, Venezuela this and whatever, is to say, you know what, like, the thing about fear is that it's all designed to get you to run away from something, and it's not a plan. Fear is not a plan. But courage is a plan. Courage is, this is what we're going to do. This is where we're going to go. This is what I'm going to stand up, and this is the action that I'm going to take. Courage is about our future. And fear is just about anxiety. And if you're sick and tired of being an anxious nation, then you have to just be rejecting fear outright. We can't allow ourselves to be governed by fear anymore. We can't allow ourselves to be governed by that kind of rationale, to say, I'm not going to allow fear to control me anymore. I am going to stand up and do the courageous thing.
Well, I think that's a great note to go out on. Thank you so much.